Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Airfix's latest release of 2024, and that is their Bristol Bulldog in 1/48 scale. It looks like a really interesting kit, so let's see how we get on. So we're going to be starting off this kit, like most, in the cockpit. Specifically, as you can see on screen now, I'm putting together the seat. The seat itself is made up of 3 components. You have 2 sidewalls and 1 back piece, which is where the pilot would sit. The rear of the seat is then cemented to some framework before being put aside. The very crisply moulded central control column is then also cemented onto some more framework, and then this subassembly can be cemented onto the underside of the seat. Fitment throughout the cockpit and the interior of the Bulldog is absolutely superb, and that is all down to some really nifty engineering by Airfix. As you can see on screen now, there is a lovely big prominent tab which really helps the user to get a secure fitment between the 2 parts. Continuing to push on with the build up of the interior of the Bulldog, here I am putting together the cockpit floor and the rudder pedals. I can now cement these 2 pieces onto what I can only assume is another structural bulkhead or something along those lines in the cockpit. Now I can start to bring everything together onto the framework. I hope you noticed that before I put the bulkhead and all the other components onto this framework, there were some very prominent locating tabs and pins which make the fitment here really good. With all the interior gubbins now pretty much put together, I thought it was an ideal point to start getting some paint down. So I primed all of the parts and sub-assemblies in Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Grey. The Bulldog seemingly had one of the more simple interiors in terms of colour, and all it needed was a coat of Mr. Colour C2 black on all of the framework. The paint was thinned in 40% paint to 60% mist levelling thinner, and it was sprayed down at around about the 1 bar mark. That is about 15 or 16 psi. And as you can see on screen, I'm also using my 0.2mm Pro Convoy. Now that everything had that base colour of black, I could start to pick out some of the details. On the whole, there aren't that many details to pick out in this cockpit, but that isn't down to Airfix trying to simplify anything, more down to the fact that World War I cockpits just aren't as busy as they are now. For picking out all of these details, I'm going to be using the Ammo MIG acrylics. These are absolutely great for brush painting, as they don't dry too quickly and they're rather forgiving. Once I was appropriately pleased that everything had been picked out in its corresponding colours, I could now seal the 2 halves or 2 bits of the framework together with a very satisfying click. Do be careful at this stage of the build not to bend or break any of those pipes, as I wouldn't want it getting broken before going into the fuselage. The forward facing bulkhead can also be cemented onto the front of this subassembly, and that just locks in the general shape and angles of the framework. Everything then received a generous coating of VMS's matte varnish. At this stage, I was personally a little bit worried that I had lost some of those details which had been moulded by Airfix, so to hopefully bring them back out, I'm going to be using Mr. Weathering Colours Greyish Brown just to lighten it up and bring out some of those details. I really like the tone of this oil wash, as it isn't too light but then it isn't too dark as well, and it almost gives this lovely dusty effect. Speaking of dust, I'm actually going to be using the dust oil brusher here just to do some dry brushing around certain areas where I want the edges to be super highlighted, and it just gives some more dimension to the cockpit. To then finish off my very reserved weathering, some might say, I'm going to be using a metallic watercolour pencil just to create some chips. Everyone has their personal preferred method for doing chips. Some people like to actually paint them on with a paintbrush. However, I have recently found that using some of these watercolour pencils gives me that little bit more control, and it's just a bit easier. On screen now is the very small instrument panel for the cockpit, but as you saw, even at that small scale, there were some very nicely printed decals to go along with them, and hey, they look like dials, so I'm not complaining at all. This can then get cemented onto the rest of the cockpit. So then I think that buttons up the cockpit assembly for this build. For how much of the cockpit you're actually going to see, I think Airfix have given you far more detail than ever would be needed, but hey, it's better to be safe than sorry. The 2 fuselage halves are then sandwiched together, revealing to us a very impressive fit. There's literally no gaps which needed to be filled here, with the exception of 1 or 2, but that was more me just being a little bit heavy-handed with my blades when getting the parts off of the sprue. A variety of different parts then have to be cemented onto the fuselage assembly. This includes what I believe is a radiator on the chin, and then also the underbelly light on the mid portion of the fuselage. Now having a look at the rear, I found that the tailplane needed to be put into place at a slight angle. I don't think this was pointed out on the instructions, so if you are building this kit, just keep in mind that if you're having a little bit of trouble, perhaps try and put it in at a slightly different angle. The under piece, I guess is the technical name for this, also cements into place with a very tight tolerance fit, so it does need a bit of pressure. Somewhere which potentially didn't have as tight a tolerance was part of the tailplane. As you'll see when I turn the plane around here, there's quite a big gap there. That was the only bit of filler which had to be used on this aircraft, and once again that was a 3-minute job with a little bit of Vallejo putty which could be wiped off with water. Now it was time to put together not one but 2 sets of wings, as this is a biplane. The wings went together quite well. The one thing I would note, and it is pointed out in the instructions for Airfix, is there are some small, I think they kind of point them out as almost moulded pieces, but from what I could see they were ejector pin marks which have to be cleaned up to ensure that you have a good fitment. A nice little addition to this kit is the fact that the ailerons are in fact movable. I did in fact utilise this feature and made one of my ailerons slightly tilted up and the other one slightly tilted down, kind of indicating that the control column on the interior has been slumped to one side. It was now time to prepare the aircraft for primer, and once again for priming the aircraft I'm going to be utilising Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Grey. This provided me with a very nice surface to then do some painting on top of. So, the first bit of painting that I wanted to do was the slightly muted silver colour of the fabric parts of the biplane. So as I was looking through my quite extensive paint collection of Mr. Hobby paints, I couldn't find a particular colour which suited my needs of being a muted silver. So to overcome this, what I did is I used the base Mr. Colour C8 silver and added about 20% of white to it. This just brought some of that sheen out of it, and as you can see, still has that metallic-y feel, but potentially not as glaring. However, one place where I did want it to be rather metallic is the front portion of the Bulldog. As you can see on the paint guide here, Airfix even shows you that it should be a different type of silver. However, after looking at some reference images, that seemingly was pure metallic aluminium or something of the sorts. To help these parts of the aircraft really pop in differentiation to the other parts or the fabricy parts of it, I made sure to base them in Mr. Colour's GX2, which is a gloss black. A gloss black base really helps to make a certain metallic colour pop and glisten. The metallic colour which I wanted to use for these areas is Super Metallic 208, which is super duraluminum. I love saying that. Anyway, when I was spraying down the super duraluminum, it was sprayed at 30% paint to 70% Mr. Rapid Thinner. So Mr. Rapid Thinner is a little bit different to what I usually use, and I actually heard about doing this down at my local model shop, which is Hannants London. I was instructed by one of the incredibly knowledgeable men down there that utilising Mr. Rapid Thinner helps to align the metallic pigment of the super metallic range. This was leading to a more shiny and metallic finish. Tips like these are only stumbled across when you are out talking to people about your projects and your issues. This is what makes Hannants London so valuable. It is a rare breed of a physical, real-life model shop, located just next to the RAF Museum. It is always filled with many model enthusiasts, yes, like you watching this video, and on top of that, it is your go-to place for all of your modelling supplies, like paints, glues, tape, and of course, lots and lots of kits. Their details are on screen now, so please do pay them a visit and check them out. I'm looking forward to seeing you down there. So having a look at the build, what have I been up to? So all I did is I unmasked those areas which are now super metallic-y, and as you can see, that Mr. Rapid Thinner worked an absolute charm. It was then a case of painting the anti-glare strip, and as I used Tamiya's paint here, which is far less resilient than the super metallic underneath, I could then use the blunt end of a cocktail stick just to chip it away and create a little bit of distressing. Now I'm back on some sub-assemblies. As you can see here, I had to make quite a few piston heads for that lovely exposed radial at the front of the Bulldog. There were 7 of the normal type, and then there was 1 for port and 1 for starboard. All of the piston heads could then be based in Mr. Colour's GX2 gloss black. And now to make them shiny, I'm going to be using Mr. Metal Colors Aluminium. Each of the piston heads had to have this top aspect of them picked out in black. I thought that the most efficient way to do this was actually going to be brush painting them. So I'm using Ammo Mig's matte black here. And once I had done that about 9 times, this was the result. And look at them all there, don't they look neat? So now I can go on to other aspects of that big radial engine, and what I'm going to be doing here is initially basing all of those components in Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 black, and now I'm going to be doing a pre-shading effect utilising a brown and a brass colour. The reason for this is I wanted to make sure that that final irony kind of tone was actually a little bit warmer than that cold slaty grey colour. So in basing the different aspects of it in the corresponding different tones of that really shiny and nice warm brass and also that brown, it ended up giving me a slightly altered tone of that final iron. As I'm spinning it here now, I hope that you can also see that the tips also kind of glisten in different lights, so I was very pleased with this effect. However, it did look a little bit too pristine for my liking, so I'm actually going to be using a track wash here to make it look a little bit more dirty and grubby. And yeah, no, look at me being resourceful, using something that isn't meant for aircraft modelling. It is good to note here that I didn't actually put any varnish on top of the iron colour here, and this was because firstly the super metallics are super durable, and also it had a nice matte finish, which is something that I wanted to utilise, as this gave a really nice gradiented there we go, effect between all of the pipes. I did then repeat this entire process throughout all of the different bits and bobs throughout the engine, and now it was time to start putting them all together. So this was a really straightforward process, and the instructions from Airfix are nice and clear and concise, so you don't have any mix-ups on the parts. Very similar to other aspects of this build, there are lots of pins and slotting mechanisms which really do give you a nice mechanical feel to this kit, which is something which I think is very impressive, as, you know, this is a plastic model kit, they're not meant to be robust, yet this does feel robust. It is also incredibly important at this stage of this build, especially, to stay with the instructions. Don't try to differ from them. When it tells you to put the parts of the engine into the fuselage, do it, as if you don't, the piston heads will not be able to fit into that front part of the fuselage, and you're just going to have a big headache. Speaking of the pistons, here they are being installed. They have quite a unique way of being put onto the aircraft. Initially what you do is you kind of clip the bottom half of the piston onto the corresponding shaft, and then you bend it out to get it at not a 45-degree angle, but maybe don't know, just below that, and then you start to push it into place. It feels a little bit weird to start bending a part on purpose, however, do it and it will work. The parts are very strong, you're not going to break anything, they're very suitably flexible. With the engine in place, I was now happy that I could move on to putting some of the decals on. I personally chose Scheme C for this, which was actually an Australian Bulldog. The decals themselves though are Airfix quality, they are printed by Cartograph, they are incredibly sharply printed, so the details are all really nice and the colours are bang on. Interestingly enough, for this build I didn't actually use a gloss coat before putting the decals on. This is because the Mr. Colour lacquers are super resilient, and also this aircraft doesn't have a huge amount of recessed details, which is something that you usually have to use a little bit more decal softener for, which usually agitates paint. So that's why I didn't end up using a gloss coat beforehand. However, the decals did leave a slight sheen to them, so to dull that back down, I used a very thin coat of VMS's satin varnish. As you've seen on screen over the past 30 seconds or so, I've started to bring everything together now. This includes, as you can see, the lower wing, also the gun sight on the forward portion of the nose, and now I'm going to start putting the struts on. The struts were something that I was a little bit apprehensive about going into this build, however the Airfix engineering was absolutely superb for this. The tolerances were super good, so good that as you can see here I fitted them, but there's no glue involved, which gives them a little bit of play, so you're not committing to a fitment before you put that upper wing surface on. The struts themselves are also suitably strong, so there is no worry that you're going to have any drooping in the long term, and yeah, you can really put a little bit of weight on them, so you don't have to be too delicate when handling. As I left them non-secured or non-cemented in, this meant that once I had certain aspects of the wing in, I could literally just wiggle them and slot them into place, and that was that. Other struts that had to be cemented were indeed the landing gear legs, and once again, super simple and super strong. So now it was time to face it. It was time to do all of the rigging for the Bulldog, and there was a lot of it. So I'm going to be using Ammo MIG's fine rigging, and honestly, it wasn't as painful as one would imagine. And the main reason for that is actually down to a design feature by Airfix. Firstly, there are pre-molded locating holes for the rigging, which helps securing it so much. And secondly is this superb bit of the instructions manual, which clearly annotates where all of the rigging should be going to and from. This was an absolute lifesaver. Now being all rigged up, we really are onto the home straight for this build. It was just a matter of starting to cement all of the final assemblies. This includes the wheels, as you can see here. Also, the one-sided bomb rack. If anyone knows why it's only one-sided, I would love to know. Also be careful, as these are explosive, so if you drop them, that could go badly wrong. There you go. But they do slot on very nicely as well. The glazing for the glass on the underside can also be cemented here. That has great fitment as well. And that is the underside sorted. So flipping it over, I now want to cement a gun onto the upper surfaces of the wings. I thought that was a pretty cool placement for one as well. Looks really cool. The propeller can be painted up. I thought these looked really cool with the brass tips. Although I think they should be copper, but you know, it's fine. This can then get cemented onto the prop shaft as well. Good thing to note is that Airfix have designed this to be movable, so you don't have to glue it in place, but I did. Of course, there had to be some more rigging to do as well. However, this one was slightly less painful. And the final thing to do to finish this build off is going to be mask off the canopy, paint it silver, and slap it on the aircraft. Also, if you would like to see this in a slightly more detail, I'll leave a link to Phoenix Scale Aviation down below, where there should be an article coming out on this in the near future. Now, all that's left is for you to have a little look at this aircraft. So without any further ado, thank you very, very much for watching. Enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.